you know, uh, the way foreign gaze has influenced the way global health is really done and has shaped our knowledge issues. But perhaps I'll start with one example, and this is something that we talk about. Dr. Kaisi also brought it up, is this lack of understanding of context and completely having everything in siloed when groups don't talk to each other. And because I'm a microbiologist and I work with diseases, I'm a microbiologist trying to figure out what causes diseases is definitely something I spend a lot of my time on. But what I also don't like is thinking that every single thing has a pharmaceutical solution. And I feel like that is a lot of what current global health preaches. Of course, there are diseases for which there are good therapeutics, good vaccines, but that also doesn't mean there aren't social determinants to those diseases. And one example that I wanted to bring up today is pneumonia and vaccines. Pneumonia in Bangladesh and many other low-middle income countries is one of the primary causes of death. And vaccines and therapeutics are constantly being pumped in. But despite being a microbiologist, I can't help but notice that there is a gradient in the number of pneumonia cases I see and the socioeconomic class, socioeconomic status of the families that bring in their children with pneumonia. I am heavily funded to do several pneumonia studies, but not a single donor has ever asked me, do you think are there other ways of fighting pneumonia? Do you think we can help with housing or provide some other care to prevent the root causes of pneumonia? And that is something that bothers me a lot, because there's this idea that no, there's only one solution and we can find it because everything has an etiology that can be solved. Everything seems to be tangible. And what baffles me is this continuation of ignorance somehow. For example, there is this one demographic surveillance site in Bangladesh that was established in the 1960s. And I don't know how many studies there have been done, how many interventions there have been, how many clinical trials have been there, and how many tenure track positions that have filled. But the health indicators of that small population-based site is no better than any other place in Bangladesh. So my question is, what has that population really benefited from? What have been the benefits to that population? And the even more baffling thing is donors keep on continuing to fund studies to understand what are the causes of diseases and what are the new preventative measures, pharmaceutical preventative measures that can be brought in. So I think I'll just end there, but I think this one example of how our knowledge is shaped.
Okay, I'll come in. So thank you for this really important question. And I think for me, I would want us to begin with thinking about the foreign versus the local, and to start interrogating these words and the language we use. Who becomes foreign, who becomes local? Because often what I find is sometimes, and this article was quite instrumental in describing how the local can sometimes write in such a way that it embodies the foreign, writing for a foreign audience, using foreign languages, or instrumentalizing research as a way to other people, And so to me, it's much more important for us to take 2 steps back. And if we're going to do that, we need to understand the definition of coloniality. Because we've agreed that colonization as a process is mostly over. Western Sahara in Africa is still colonized. There's a couple of other countries you could argue, but coloniality has remained. And to me, coloniality is this condition that survives beyond the period of colonization. It's an invisible power structure that sustains colonial relations of exploitation and domination long after colonization has ended. And in some way, we breathe coloniality all the time. So then what is this process of decolonization? And it really is a political, epistemological, economic liberation project. It's aimed at dislodging coloniality and all of its manifestations right at the root. And it's a practice of ways of like actually doing, disentangling, delinking, um, reclamation, rebuilding, and moving away. So now when we need to kind of like understand, but now what's this foreign local? We need to understand how does this coloniality continue into our ways of being and doing. And for that, we need to, one of Sabelo Ndlovu Kancheni describes, is looking at things in terms of the coloniality of knowledge, coloniality of power, and the coloniality of being. And the case between the local and the global, or the foreign, because you could even argue that settler colonial Canada, settler white settler colonies are still foreign to the indigenous, Native American. So it's defining, how do we define who's local, global? How do we define who's foreign? And then when we start understanding coloniality of power, it's deepening our understanding of why the ways in which we write, or the foreign gaze, reinforces a asymmetrical power relation. And how then does these writings, so the publications you're producing, how is it a technology of domination, of control, of exploitation, and of violence? Because to me, these kinds of coloniality is actually a form of violence. So we're saying that this foreign gaze is a form of violence because it decides to write about a particular people in a particular way, in some ways removing their ability to say and write and decide for themselves, without declaring that my view as a writer, I am not neutral. I come with a particular bias. I come with a particular perspective. I come with a particular point of view, and my point of view is now being imposed onto this group of people who I've decided cannot speak for themselves. So to me, it's really understanding how, and then the coloniality of power, it becomes, Latin American scholar Cross-Fiegel speaks about 9 forms of coloniality of power. But here you are zooming into epistemic power and linguistic power. And I would like encourage you to unpack what does that mean? And that means really looking at language. Like we talk about going to the field to do research. The field is another language that was instituted by anthropologists in colonial times for them to go and do research on these Indians and Africans and whatever to understand. So we adopt a language. In South Africa, we've adopted the language of racial categorizations of white, Indian, colored, black. I'm supposed to be an Indian South African, but I'm not Indian. Indian's a nationality. I could be racialized in a different way, and 4 categories. Everyone's got to fit in. These are constructs that come from the periods of colonization, but actually they continue. So they part of coloniality of power and knowledge, and they operate in the ways in which we continue to write from a foreign perspective. Yeah, and then of course it's this idea that if you are from the north or you're from a different country, you have no knowledge of the locals. You have no knowledge of the context. You have no knowledge of, you don't have the deepened knowledge. So how responsible are what you're writing? How responsible is it for this population, and who in the community has validated your views? Yeah, I'll stop there.
I would just like to come in, and I so agree with Senjuti and Shehnaz. What I want to bring into the discussion is to look at the epistemic knowledge and the disciplines and so on. And I think it's just the foreign knowledge for me, sitting in India and studying health systems and health system strengthening. While I was looking at health systems frameworks, I looked at around 40 health systems framework just to realize that all of them have come from 1 or 2 countries, So looking at health system strengthening frameworks, they have also come from the US or the UK. And going further, I realize all of them are actually coming from economists trained in the US organizations. So I just felt this is foreign knowledge to me. Where is the knowledge from India about their health systems? where is the knowledge from these sociologists? I could hardly find just one or two frameworks from these sociologists talking about health systems and describing health systems as social systems. So it's always like, there's someone else who's coming and telling the communities what their health systems are, how can they improve their health systems, as if before, the advent of this knowledge, the people were not taking care of themselves or not taking care of their families or not taking care of their health of the society. So I feel what we today understand as modern medicine, evidence-based medicine, where is this knowledge coming from? And there's a need to question what we understand as evidence. How do we ridicule, the home remedies that our mothers practice at home? How do we ridicule the traditional practices of birthing, traditional dyes, and so on, And we just call it not evidence-based. So this whole project of what is evidence, what counts as evidence, what does not count as evidence, does only that count as evidence, which is published in, highly paid, peer-reviewed, double-blinded peer-reviewed journals, or what the previous speaker was talking about, tacit knowledge. So challenging that evidence and what we understand as evidence, what we understand as correct or incorrect or supported or not supported. This is all I feel is a part of the colonial project, and this is all the foreign knowledge for us. I'll just take a pause there and just come in terms of other aspects of coloniality as we move forward. Over.
Thanks for inviting me first. I'm really happy to join. Very interesting.
I think the
You hear me?
audio might be like going in and out a little bit.
Maybe it's the connection. Can you hear me okay?
Good.
So when thinking about it, I think the first thing it reminds me the foreign gaze was written along two articles that we published at BMG Global Health. The first one was Who is Telling the Story? And in that review, we were actually simply looking at different articles for research being done in Africa. And we were comparing where the African researchers were fitting, knowing that the first and the last authors are the most important in the publication. And we were realizing that less than 40% of Africans were actually having that position in those articles. And the second one that we also published along with the Foreign Gaze editorial was one called Stuck in the Middle. And the question we were asking ourselves, again, we folks from Harvard, was what is the likelihood of an African researcher to be first or last author if he or she is collaborating with a top university in the US? And you won't be surprised that the higher the university, the less chance you have to be first or last authors. And it pushed us, and I really appreciate, and I was really excited with the editorial because the question that we were asking ourselves, one, who is telling the story? And for who are we, even ourselves, telling the story? Are we telling the story for our population, our community? How many people in our community are actually reading those articles? If we really want to have an impact in the policy, I was hearing talking about pneumonia. If I do a study on pneumonia and I publish on the Lancet, how many Ministry of Health, how many Director General, how many people in a rural environment who are actually taking care of those patients will read that article? In the same time, if I don't write in those journals, how am I going to change the policy with the WHO and all those? So it was so real to think that we definitely need to have the local solution to a global problem. And that's a very, very challenging exercise. Because even when you write your article, especially when you come to review, you are struggling because the reviewer is somewhere in Geneva or New York or Paris, and then he's seeing the world from a different perspective, and he's sending you all those queries, and you are fighting with him and with yourself and say, okay, what am I supposed to do? Is it still the message that I want to send? And while preparing this conversation, I was just imagining myself, now we are in COVID era, but we've also seen that we have, I think, a couple of cases of Ebola in DRC, a couple of cases in Guinea. What if Ebola went out of Africa as it did in 2015, and then we realized that the vaccine or the drugs are produced only in Africa? What will happen? And I was just imagining the African Union saying that, okay, we'll first give the vaccine to our community, and at some point, we'll give 20% of the dose to the Western. I was just imagining what will be the feeling. And then if they do so, just imagine at the end of the outbreak, then the African Union will write a nice article in a scientific African journal saying how they've been supporting and helping the West and the world. And this is quite striking on how we need to take ownership of our stories. Sometimes we won't be able, because the journal, we don't own those journals. There was an editorial from the Lancet Global Health, I think last month, also sharing the same title, Who's Telling the Story? And they were committing themselves to give more voice to the country in the South. But how many journals will do that? And even to which extent will they do that? If you come with a strong local message that you want to send, how will it be welcome? So how do we move from there? And from my perspective, and that's also the challenge raised with the foreign gaze, should we have our own journal where we can communicate? Now, when I publish an article in an international journal, I also try to make sure that in the newspaper in the country, I send the same information, because that's what the Minister of Health is going to read. That's what our community are going to read. So that the information, while I'm trying to tap up there, I'm also down there. I think that's something that I will definitely advocate for. I suppose that.
Before we sort of move on to the next question, does anyone else want to weigh in on, what's been discussed so far? Okay, thank you so much. I think really, really insightful answers, and I think really engaging conversation has been started. Our next question is kind of situated in the fact that, as students that are located in the global north, and I know this was kind of touched on in the earlier conversations, positionality plays a role in engaging with global health. Who are you? What land are you on? How are you in relation to the work you're doing? And as students, I think, especially from my perspective, I have roots in a land that was colonized, and now I'm settler on a land that, is rooted in settler colonialism. So what kind of questions would you like those interested in global health work to ask themselves before engaging?
I will maintain the cycle and start. For me, global health is actually very new, and I didn't even realize that I was in global health. I, did very basic biology, then I moved to Bangladesh, and I wanted to work in public health, do projects, research projects, or work in surveillance, work with hospitals for improving public health, for improving local health. And as I started, working in public health, because it was new, of course, I did a lot of readings to understand how to implement projects, what are the ethics of public health, what's the framework of these ethical considerations. As I continued my work, at some point, I don't even know when, I realized I was in global health, because I was working with different collaborators in the global north, in the global south, and there's this entire field called global health. And my father has been practicing public health forever. When I told him about global health, he was like, huh, what's that? We know public health, we know how to improve public health. So that to me actually was not a field that I knew of, but I gradually realized I was in it. So when I think of public health, global health, sorry, when I think of global health, I think there are certain questions that we ask in public health that should be transferred into global health also, that can also form like this framework of ethical grounds. There is a paper that was published by Nancy Cass, and there she kind of posed 6 questions that should be asked before any study is rolled out, any program is rolled out. And I can like briefly go through the questions. One of the question was, what are the public health goals of a project? Right? Even if it is a global project that's been implemented somewhere else or program that is being implemented, what are the public health goals? What are the benefits to the public or to that community? And the program, the study that will be implemented, how effective is it going to be in actually reaching that goal? Are there potential burdens of the study or the program? Now, every research study, every project has burdens, even if it means stopping someone on the street who's just waiting at a red light anyways, asking someone a question for 2 seconds, you're taking that person's 2 seconds. That is a burden. So every project, every program has burden. We have to very, very critically analyze what are the burdens of every program, of every study. The next question should be, can these burdens be minimized? Can I ask 2 questions instead of trying to get more data and ask 5 questions? And are there alternative approaches? Can I not ask questions at all? Can I do something else to get my answers? And then finally, the final 2 are, if the project is it implemented fairly? Am I just going to a rural population because they always will answer my questions, but not go to an urban population because people are more educated there perhaps and will not answer my question? Am I looking at all populations equitably or fairly? And finally, hoping that the first 2 questions were answered and there are indeed benefits to a project, are these benefits balanced with the burdens that we have already by now figured out? So I think these are questions that we try to answer in local public health projects, and this should be answered by every global health project. And the moment we try to go through them systematically, we have to have 2-way conversations with local researchers, with people who have the most knowledge about how to answer each of these questions. This will force 2-way conversations. We should have like timeline for the benefits and the processes and how to measure the benefits that will be that hopefully the community will attain from this program. Now, to this sixth question, from my experience in the last few years in global health, I want to add a 7th question. And that 7th question I recommend adding is, what capacity will be left in that community or in that country to make the benefits of this project long-term, to make the benefits of this project sustainable? And the moment we ask that question, we force all our collaborators, we force all our donors to ask that question. It needs to bring in local ownership. And any project, the benefits of any project will go very far and will be sustainable only if there is local ownership. So I think I'll end there, but those are my suggestions.
Okay, I'll come in just to keep the circle going. I think for me, it goes back to, again, this recognition. And I think, Divya, you situated yourself so fundamentally into this conversation and question. And the question there is, it shows that you're starting to reflect on who you are, where you come from, and what has this colonial project had an impact on you and your life, you know. And so then you kind of have to recognize that you are colonized. I am colonized. We are all colonized. We are colonized beings. Our mind is colonized. Our beings are colonized. Our ways of doing is colonized. And we have to then go back to this history where we have to recognize that in order for us to be colonized, parts of us needed to be eradicated. Parts of us needed to be destroyed. And that is a historic fact where we go back and we look at history, where we see that Ramon Grosfoguel, again, Latin American scholar, talks about epistemicides. So this destruction of knowledge systems, which means then we need to look at the fact that there are knowledge systems that operate, and that whether you live in the global north or global south or whatever, you operate within a knowledge system. Okay, and the knowledge system defines what you do and how you think. And it also defines the field. So I just like Senjuta, we don't talk about global health. I'm not a global health scholar. I'm a public health scholar because, it's about the public. It's not about, it's like global music, and then you have like, you have American music, and then you have global music. Like, just lump it all together. It's another form of othering. But if it's public health, it situates me. It's not about the private sector, it's about the people, and I'd push it further to say the people's health. So language is also important. But going back to your question, and not the segue I just went on, it's again reflecting on the fact that if we are colonized, that means that we inherently have been dehumanized, because that's essentially what the colonial project is all about. And it's not necessarily something that affected those who have come from, who were in the colonial, who are the colonized nations. It's something that affected more broadly everybody. So if you look at what it is, it's the denial of the humanity of certain people. It's a process of inferiorization and dehumanization. And it's about the othering of the colonized people compared to a white subject. So ultimately, if you are not a white subject, and most likely a white male subject, you are othered in this process. So even if you begin the process of doing work, you're already starting from a place where you are othered, and you are never really good enough, or you're never really able to be fully human. And I think we need to disentangle that idea, right? That it starts with like how do we gain back our humanity? And if we look at South African anti-apartheid Black consciousness scholar Steve Biko, he spoke about, his quote is, "The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressed is the mind." The most potent weapon in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. So colonization, the worst form of it is when it shapes people's consciousness and identity. And frankly, all of us are affected by it. So we need to go through this process of deep reflexivity and figuring out how does this impact on us? So if we have to look at an example of abortion and the gag rule, for example, which is now is being repealed by the new American government. And what it does is it shows us that, it's a kind of coloniality of power, but it deeply impacts on the humanity of people on the ground. So women are asking themselves, like, women's lives are controlled, women's bodies are controlled, women are made to be shamed and guilt, women's agency is taken away. And there's a lot of assumption that all women in low middle income countries have the same views on abortion and all just, need to be schooled, whatever. So I think it's about understanding how these power relations occur, but how they play out in what you do and what you don't do, how you think and how you don't think. And it's about how they play out even in the incentives that inform the decisions you make. Who are you going to publish with? Which project are you going to be part of? How are you going to start observing whether the research methods chosen for this project is not asking enough questions that understand the lived reality of the people, or if they are a bunch of quantitative questions that answer what the research is interested in, not meeting the needs of the social justice agenda that is shaped by the community. So there are many ways in which you can do it, but it definitely begins by asking yourself, how am I colonized? How am I inferiorized? How am I made to feel superior? And how do I reclaim an identity that delinks from this idea of inferiority and superiority? And again, I mean, just to go back, it starts with philosophy, because in the Western epistemology, the founding philosophy is based on I think, therefore I am. And for the life of me, I just forgot the name of the professor that, a Cartesian philosophy. I think, therefore I am. So I am all powerful. I can do, I am a being, I do what I want to do. It's not really an accountability. But then if you shift to some of the Eastern and African philosophies, they bring a different cosmology. And African philosophy starts with, I am because we are, you know, Ubuntu Ngabantu. And that philosophy shifts fundamentally the core of who you are and how you exist in the world and for whom you exist. So therefore, I do not exist to serve me. I exist to serve the community, you know. And then when you really see how westernized and colonized you are, you can then start feeling the pain, because it's a painful feeling. And this project is supposed to evoke a lot of difficult emotions, you know, the pain and the trauma that comes with having lost so much of you, so much of your identity. In some cases, your language, in some cases, your connection to home, in some cases, your culture. And then you sit in the pain of that, because it's a visceral project, it's not an intellectual project. How does it inform what you do and why you're doing what you do? That becomes the question that will inform your ways of being in the world. Yeah.
Okay. This circle is very problematic to maintain, especially after Shehnaz. I'll just bring this back to that. I'll talk about global public health and the governance of global public health. So, along with questioning who we are, in this landscape, what our positions are, knowing, being more aware of that, I think what we also need to start with is understanding what we mean by global health, asking what global health truly is about. Is it about the health for all around the world, or is it just a continuation of international health, as one of you pointed out? Is it still about protecting the health of the others across our borders, or is it actually about the health of all? And if it is about the health of all, then how equal are we treating these all? Are we still protecting the health of the global north and therefore investing in the health of global south so that the diseases are not cross-spreading? Are we still in the era of sanitary conferences, blaming the rise of all diseases to be Asiatic and Asia to be filth and dirt and spreading diseases like cholera and plague and so on? Or are we talking about the diseases which are coming from the north as well, which is about unhealthy diets? Was it about westernization of everything, including diseases and so on? So I feel it's important to reflect what we mean by global. There are many meanings of global health. And what I understand as global public health, what do we mean by global public health? Is it truly global in its nature, especially because of the supranational nature that we have kind of assumed to global health? And what I feel is the biggest problem with global health, the way we understand it today and the way it's functioning, is the problem of accountability, especially with the coming in with of a large number of actors complicating this already complicated landscape of global health. Every day, newer actors joining in, and there is no supra national organization overseeing all of these partners, organization, global health actors, and so on. So we need to be cognizant of who these organizations are accountable to. Are they only accountable to their boards, or are they accountable to the people, or are they accountable for the actors like World Bank? Are they accountable to their trustees and the people who are actually giving them, the money to invest? So as a process for the practitioners, the students, researchers in global health, we need to reflect reflect and reflect, and act and reflect, and it's a process, and make us accountable for what we're doing. We should be aware of where our accountability lies first. Does it lie to one who's providing us this education? Does this provide to those whose knowledge we are harvesting, building our knowledge on? Where does our accountability lie? And also challenge this whole mechanism in which the accountability function is working right now. Challenge what we understand these mechanisms are. Challenge the idea that the Gates Foundation, which is the most important actor in global health right now, who is that actor accountable to? Is it just accountable to its own family because it's charity work and period? Or is it actually accountable to the people whose health is it affecting? I feel every global health project should be accountable to the people that it's serving. The way global health works right now, especially through global health initiatives like these, has no clear mechanism to be accountable to the people at the receiving end, be it bilateral agencies, be it multilateral agencies, even the kinds of WHOs which are most democratic. The accountability stops at the level of the governments or the elected representatives and so on. But the people who are actually at the receiving end of these initiatives of global health projects, do they have a voice in these initiatives and these policies? And also the other side of the people who are actually contributing from their tax monies to these bilateral projects and multilaterals and so on, do they have a voice in deciding where their money should be spent? So can we talk about, bridging that gap and creating those clear channels of accountability while we also reflect our positions on where our accountability lies? I'll just take a pause there.
And then if we have Yap, are you there?
Disclaimer. I was feeling alone being the only male in this portal of WGH. So this is Asha, is my boy, and I'm taking care of him. So I will cut the camera. You can say hi, Asha. So I think the most important, which is what Sumegha has been talking about, whatever we are doing it for the community. And the challenge is, how are we accountable for that community? We have a large amount of money put in project, put in research. And once we've done, we have a nice publication in a nice journal and a nice report. And then the feedback to the community and by the community, it's no longer there. I remember when I was in Uganda, in any project that we were implementing, there was a need for community advisory board that need to be part of the project to ensure that the project makes sense for the community, but then also at the end of the project, I think that's what was mentioned in the equation, what will remain and what will be sustainable for that community after the project has taken place. And it is also a challenge that when you launch a project, humanitarian crisis and so on, we don't always think of what will happen when we leave. And sometimes we leave the population in a worse condition than before we arrive. So we are really at that stage where we are critically thinking how the community can have a stronger position on whatever we are doing. And this is really a call for action for us researchers, for us experts, to make sure that the community is part at all we are designing the project, they have to be there. And then how it is quite difficult. You need to know, are we talking about the politician? Are we talking about the poor women in the village? Are we talking about the religious leaders? It's quite challenging, but we have to do the right thing. I pause there.
Thank you. So We actually had a question come in that was sort of related to something I think you were saying, Dr. Asthana, about the Gates Foundation. And so the question is, can you comment on the role that funding organizations like the Gates Foundation play as instruments of colonial ideologies? For example, the Gates Foundation provides approximately 10% of WHO funding and is often lauded as the forefront of global health, but we also forget that Bill Gates is investing his personal fortune is an expression of power because the foundation has the financial power to invest in specific types of questions, knowledge, and people that align with their goals and ideologies. And essentially, the crux of the question is, how do you disentangle yourselves in potentially receiving funding from organizations like the Gates Foundation? And what do you think are the implications of conversations surrounding decolonizing global health for the current funding system? And thank you, Neha Malhotra, for this question.
I always love taking this question. I think as a simple rule in terms of accepting funds or getting on the projects funded by these organizations, the simple rule is to look at who they're accountable to. And that will give us a fair idea of who they're working for. And especially for philanthropies, a lot has been written about on philanthrocapitalism and also the models of the Gates and the Gavis following the Gates. The areas that they invest, totally, it's their money, for philanthropies and whatever they want to invest in. If it's my earned fortune, I would like to invest it in anywhere. But while in global health or global public health, what we call it, when the consequences are for the health of a larger population, we must critically look at these actors because they are public actors. We must examine them critically from a public perspective or a public health perspective, and not just technically, not just some innovators who are trying to experiment things and come up with new knowledge and evidence to advance the existing knowledge and so on. So it depends. So for example, Gates very explicitly says that we are in for technological solutions to problems, and we always assume that somebody else will take care of taking up the issues of last mile connectivity or implementing the issues. Will produce vaccines, but that doesn't mean that the onus is on us to implement those vaccines, reaching the last miles and so on, and we assume that the others will take care. There are all kinds of schools of thoughts to this, but as a practitioner myself and as a researcher myself, my own position, I just examine these actors to see who are they accountable to. That just gives me a fair sense of where their priorities lie, who defines their priorities, what are their stances on health systems. Gates particularly has been very vocal about not investing in health systems at all, thinking it's a black box and you don't know where the money is going. Rather just, they say health systems don't kill people, but diseases do, so we'll invest in diseases. So we look at those positions of these actors to make our stance, to clarify our positions, whether we should be working with them, against them, using their funds, or critiquing them, or challenging their ideas, or examining our ideas against their ideas. I'll take that further if time permits, because I love talking about this. Oh,
okay, I'll come in. I think for me, it's also about recognizing that, as much as Gates is incredibly philanthropic, he understands that knowledge is power. And that's how he's producing power. He's sustaining his power through knowledge, and I think that goes back to, whose ideas count, whose views are imposed, whose knowledge informs policy-making processes, whose knowledge informs systems of management and systems of accountability, as was brought up, how does unconscious bias influence? Then, so many other issues. And I suppose it is part of the system of domination of knowledge that we need to understand what is it about the way these global funds, these global, whether they're Gavi, that's moving us away from comprehensive primary care to selective primary care, or if it's Gates who has a seat at every table, including the WHO, where he really influences the research, the whole health agenda. It's knowing how systems of domination operate through these people and what they do. And I think if you're sitting in the South and you have an issue of access to healthcare for sex workers, for example, or access to TB care, or you don't have a choice, you can't say no to money that comes anywhere. I think the difference for me is it's what Sumegha was saying about accountability. It's making sure that in the clauses of those things, you ensure that the accountability, the reporting isn't back to the donor, but that it is a shared accountability across the different actors who navigate and assume very multiplicity of identities in the process of conducting research. And then the second thing is, oh, my point is completely lost now. I just completely lost it. What was it? I think I'll come back to it just to not waste time.
Does anyone else want to weigh into this?
Yes, let me come in. It's quite a challenging decision. If you are a big organization like we do, Doctor Without Borders, we actually decide not to take the money of the Gates Foundation. We work with them in many different projects, but we don't take that money. Why? Because we want to be able, as Sumegha was saying, to critique when we are not in agreement, and to ensure that accountability, there is always someone who can say, no, that's right, that's not right. But we can do that also because of the fund that we do have. I'm just imagining a small local NGOs in a country that will have as the only possibility of funding the Gates Foundation. How will they put themselves in a position to challenge them, not to critique, actually to challenge them and say, okay, no, we are accountable not to you as the donor, but we are accountable to our community. And I think we should find a way, though it's challenging, find a way to strengthen and to stimulate those local organizations and all those different entities who would like to challenge, but may fear that if they do so, they won't get the funding. So I would say it's a bit more complex than we can see.
I
remember my point. Let me just quickly say it. It's really, to me, it's about viewing, it's about the way in which we in the South need to shift the way we view funding. So it's no longer aid. We've got to question that word, and we've got to start being true to what it is sometimes, which is reparations. And that's a whole conversation to have. And it's and it's emerging, and Paul Farmer and a few people have written a book about it. But I think that reparations is a conversation we need to start having quite urgently. And that's going to shift the asymmetrical power balance. Thank you. Sorry, Senjuti.
No problem. So I just wanted to chime in with Yap and kind of talk about that other side where I am part of a small local NGO in Bangladesh. And because of the funding structure in Bangladesh, we have to depend on donors like the Gates Foundation. And, it's a very challenging decision every day. We have to very critically look at the projects we are doing with them. We have to ensure that at least we are true to ourselves. We are doing the projects that mean the most to us. We are not implementing every project that we are asked to implement. We are very clear about that. Sometimes we will say no to projects and, make our team smaller, let some people go, but those are decisions we have to make because right now we don't have much of an option. But I am glad that we are having these conversations, right? And I'm sure the more I talk about these in these public forums, the more my fundability goes down. And more is the potential that I'm also losing some collaborators as I continue talking. But, like I am seeing a change even within our community where, we are a bunch of local NGOs. We are trying to figure out what to do. Like, why do we have to present them progress reports every other week or like every month? What does that even mean? And how are we like ensuring that we are true to the science we are doing, and we are also true to the public health, the field, people's health, as Shehnaz was saying. Like, I just wanted to bring up a little bit at the end that when we talk about decolonization, I know it's a word that's used so commonly now. And, it's a word that it's very difficult for me to understand. And I think it's actually very difficult for many global South people to understand, because I think it's an English word. Like, I don't know, at least in my language, there is no translation of decolonization. So when I think about decolonization, or when I talk to my grandparents or even my parents about it, it is a revolutionary concept. When I talk about, this is what decolonization, this is what the gist is, they're like, oh, then don't take it so lightly. It means fighting. When India got independence from the British Raj, because this is the situation that has been reflected over here. It was not like, there were like some fun discussions over panels where the British and the Indians sat together, drank tea, and decided, okay, now you leave. There were lives that was sacrificed, right? And lives sacrificed by teenagers, by people in their early 20s. There is Ram Prasad, Durgavati, Pritilata, who gave their lives for independence from the colonizer. So that is the word decolonization should encapsulate. And if we are going to move forward with it, we have to figure out how to talk to our colleagues in Bangladesh, in Bangla, about this, because this is a concept that is not even taken up by the global South yet. It's still quite a lot discussed in the global North. Again, it's probably not the right way of doing things. And I really hope as we go forward, as we try to change this dynamics or the structure of global health, I hope we don't have to give our lives. But I do think we have to give something up. As people in the global South, we have to give up self-interest to a large extent. We have to have very uncomfortable conversations. We have to raise our voices, and we have to work in unity. We lack unity within ourselves also. And I know this is all easier than done, but it is supposed to be difficult. We have to accept that it is difficult, but we have to put it in our minds, as Shehnaz was saying constantly. We have to liberate our minds. We have to decolonize ourselves. And it's, not only about representation. It's not only about authorship. It's a lot more than that. It's a lot about being extremely uncomfortable, sacrificing a lot so that the next generation of researchers, next generation of scientists don't have to have these conversations. Yeah, I think I'm going to end there before I lose more fundability.
Thank you so much for those really thought-provoking answers. And actually that leads us really well into the next question, which builds on this idea of what is decolonization. So Jaloku Gachani, a prominent professor at the University of South Africa, warns that the word decolonization has become a buzzword and a metaphor. Instead, he says, decolonization has to remain a revolutionary term with theoretical and practical value. And so what are some ways that we can ensure that decolonization remains radical?
I think I kind of already answered that question, so I'm gonna go to Shehnaz.
Okay, I'll come in then to keep the circle going, even though I intervened. I think for me, it's also, I think Senjuti captured it beautifully, to ask the question of what is it that we're willing to give up? How brave are we going to be in order to move to the space that we want to go? So Gates is not going to sit here and say, oh, you guys, here you go, here's my power, go ahead, keep it, do things the way you want to do it. I'll be accountable. He's not going to do those things. So in some ways, we have to go out there and fight. We need to claim, we need to reclaim And I think as a South African, we draw quite a lot strongly from the Rhodes Must Fall and the Fees Must Fall movement. And the African, decolonial move that was linked to, when Africa was beginning the decolonization work, a lot of Latin American, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara came to Africa to really build the military might of the critical thinkers. Steve Biko, they conscientized their minds about these things. They used their bodies, they used their minds, they used all forms of resistance. Then they organized and they mobilized and they found ways to critically get to where the heart of power is and to physically reclaim back, and often I think, just to say, like, in what myself and my colleagues have done in Africa is last year we held a African Health Futures project. We held a conference like this. We brought together African scholars in a conversation intentionally about decoloniality. And we really try to grapple with how does decolonial practice influence how we do health every day. And, in the starting place, you guys wrote in your concept note that health is depoliticized. And we need to depoliticize health. And once it becomes political, we then can start drawing on political strategies, liberation theology that is rooted in fundamentally addressing some of these issues, which means we need to cross the borders of our medical schools and our health science faculties to the social sciences and to draw on some of these theories and understand what we can learn from them and understand why it's so important for the power structures to continue to keep health apolitical. And once we start doing that, I think the praxis side of things becomes real. And remember that radicalization is a term that everybody's using. So you could call those who stormed the White House radical for what reason, for what purpose. So being radical is not necessarily a good thing. You could be an extreme radical, but if your intention is for social justice, and if your intention is clear about achieving an health equity, social justice goal, and you are adopting principles that are feminist, that bring on board the needs of women, that bring on board the needs of the marginalized, that bring on board those who are sitting on the margin, and you recognize that this work is slow moving, slow building, and it's an iterative process, which means you start, you make a mistake, you go back, you deepen your understanding of social justice, you start again, you mobilize again, you try something new, you question your things, and you move forward in that fashion. That way you can actually get movement and traction. The other thing I think to be clear is the Colonial Project makes it clear to us that we are othered. We are less so. We are not enough. And we have to break down that thought and remember that we do not start from a deficit model. That actually the knowledges, the libraries of knowledges that live within us are valid, they're legitimate, and we need to reclaim them. Once we reclaim those knowledges, that's your power. That's where your power lies. Then you don't need to start fighting against the global powers. You start forming your own ways of being and doing. Because ultimately, we're going to be distracted if we keep saying, Gates, you're doing things wrong. Gates, you're doing things wrong. You could use that hour that you've spent protesting Gates to rebuild, rethink, doing responsible, legitimate, responsible work, deepening accountability, producing health outcomes, or producing literature that can then start shaping a new world. So the two need to sit side by side. We need to name power. We need to protest power. We need to disrupt power alongside reclaiming ourselves, reclaiming our identity, and doing the hard work in our minds, in our bodies, in our feelings, but ultimately to liberate our imaginations. And that is the hard work, because you then have to think, not imagining within a Western epistemology or a way of thinking. You almost have to shift yourself out of that and think, imagine in new kinds of epistemology or pre-colonial epistemology, or a different way of thinking and being. And then your imagination can run free, because you're no longer thinking from a place of deficit or from othering. You're thinking from a place of power and strength. And nobody can actually put your power out, or your light, put your fire out, that fire that sits in your belly. You can never allow that to happen. That's the power from which you drive your social justice work. Yeah.
Thank you. So actually, we're going to ask an audience question, and maybe we'll start with Sumegha or Yap for this question, and then kind of go around. And it's kind of what we were talking about earlier with the Gates Foundation, but a follow-up question is, we've spoken a lot about decolonization. It's from Sarah O'Sullivan, and coloniality, and even the Gates Foundation, but we haven't yet spoken about global health's intimate relation with capitalism, which is a process that runs on extraction and exploitation. Can the speakers talk about why capitalism seems to be the elephant in the room here? And a similar comment was kind of given by Sudeepta, which is I think it's also important to challenge the idea that wealth that is being donated is earned. Billionaires, not just the Gateses, but also philanthropic tycoons in the global South, are produced by a system of capitalism where wealth is derived from the exploitation of others. Part of their philanthropy actually serves to wash their image from ruthless capitalists to benevolent donors. So that is the next question.
I don't know how much justice will I be able to do to that question, but I'll try. As I said, a lot has been written about philanthropy and why philanthropy is done. Is it just a means of saving taxes? Is it about doing away with the guilt that the North has for the South for exploiting them and over-exploiting them? Is it just saving ourselves from the harms of the extremism that we have done? For example, there was this, increase in philanthropy and what I call as philanthrocapitalism in many ways, as called by is the post 26/11 attack. The US got more stringent on the only way to handle terrorism is to invest more in charity and helping these nations, not to get too extreme. There's a lot written about gifting and charity and relating to our day-to-day life, that when we gift, we expect that the one that we are gifting to will oblige. Talking about bilaterals and trade relations and so on. So when we in the South receive aid from these, these bilateral agencies, there is an inherent unspoken understanding that our trade relations will be only with these countries and we shouldn't be buying anything else. And India has had those uncomfortable relations, after which it decided to kind of say no to a few of the bilateral agencies and so on. But yes, I think the idea of capitalism and why is that an elephant in the room, and the idea of coloniality and our project of decolonization, a starting point for us, what I feel would be a good starting point is to center the idea of equality. The decolonization project should focus on the idea of equality. And I would stress that I'm not talking about equity. I'm talking about equality, where everyone is equal, whereas the idea of equity kind of, and similarly for the neo-colonial ideas and so on, talk about someone else deciding what you deserve to be at a position where we would want you to be. Reservations, equities, all of these ideas kind of create a supremacy of me deciding for the other communities on what they deserve to be, where they should be, or where I feel they should be. But the idea of equality kind of promotes that everyone is equal and has equal rights on resources, on including capital resources and so on. So I think which is an antithesis to capitalism, right? And that's where these contradictions lie, and that's how I see this whole project of promoting equality, be it for health, be it for capital resources, be it for as simple as accessing health services, you know. And a lot of our, going back to the question of what decolonization is or coloniality is, and what Shehnaz and Senjuti and Yap has been talking about is the way of thinking that we have to now move forward from the way we understand our health systems, the way we understand how to improve our health systems, and not get in that trap of, even decolonization getting to the same level of rhetoric as have been the other overused terms in health systems, like health system strengthening, health resilience, which have been so overused that no one really knows what it means. So starting point would be, one, to develop a common understanding by what we mean as decolonization. And when I say a common understanding, it necessarily doesn't mean that it has to be the same understanding in all levels. It has to be contextual. It has to be context relevant, depending on the colonial histories of particular subjects, whether they were the oppressors or the oppressed, and what kind of oppression that was, and what kind of cause does that need to now decolonize. We are still struggling with, concepts like health system strengthening, which are being used for over 30 years now. And we still see, every day newer paper coming in to talk about what we understand by health system strengthening. Here are the common principles that we should look at health system strengthening. We're still debating whether, vertical approaches count as health system strengthening or not, whether disease-specific initiatives count as health system strengthening or not, whether the donor-supported thing should be counted as health system strengthening or not. So I think now that we're jumping on this journey to decolonizing, we must develop a common understanding, which is then adapted to the context in which we are applying, which is owned by the people in that context where it is being applied. To that, I feel should be a good start to shift the ownership, and us not counting, us not developing that measure of equity and what their decolonization journey should be like, but base all of our ideas on the premise of equality, treat everyone as equal, and not just reinforce, let's not just become the neo-colonizers by trying to help them. The Britishers also came to, civilize us. So let us not go in that journey of civilizing others and helping them to be what we think is at par with what they should be. I am not sure if I answered that, but happy to discuss more. Over.
Thank you. And then maybe Yap, if you're available, if you could also sort of give your perspective on this as well.
Yes, definitely. The issue of capitalism, and when we are seeing what is happening currently with the COVID and the vaccine, you realize that the people who are making the vaccine are not humanitarian. When a country like South Africa is buying the dose of the vaccine twice the price as compared to the Western country, I mean, it's unacceptable. So, but it also play in the decolonization, because if we had invested ourselves, and I think that way it goes back to how our communities, like how our community are investing on what is happening ourselves. If we are investing with our money to produce our drugs, produce our vaccine, then we will rely less on the West and the US to give us whatever we need. But we have to push and bring more ownership at the level of the community. I think that's our role. How can we engage more our community in that process of colonization? Thank you.
Should I come in? Okay, I'll come in on this question. I think for me, it's building on what Sumegha and Yap has said. It's going back to the understanding of what is the colonial matrix of power. And the three biggest elements is racism, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism. But the particular form of capitalism may differ at different places. But in South African context, it's white monopoly capital. And this white monopoly capital is linked to a mining industry in South Africa where gold and diamonds were mined. And the local people were made to work in those mines. First, they were othered legislatively through apartheid laws. And in the post-apartheid South Africa, they continue to be othered through coloniality and neo-colonialism that maintains a kind of mining-driven economy to the detriment of those who are poor, who are Black, who are women, And so we had a few years ago when some of the miners in South Africa were protesting for just a minimum wage. And this is the Marikana massacre. We had a massacre. We had a Marikana massacre. So these miners were protesting, and through some orders from those in positions of power, our government, miners were shot in their back, running away from the police, which led to a long investigation, which really shows how our governments are still incentivized by a global market that they have to operate in. Fundamentally, what that means is that health becomes a commodity. Health is commodified. And this is where we need to start the deep conversation about health and capitalism. Because so long as health is commodified and it's made to be instrumentalized for money, either by the private healthcare system, by the pharmaceutical companies, by the Gates Foundation, by other, the World Trade Organization, that often comes to these global health conferences because they're all there, in the same conference as the same people who are fighting the social justice fight. They all come to the same place, and we're all having parallel conversations over each other, but each of them comes from a different standpoint. And I think this question is vital. It's actually the root of the conversation for me in health, and why decolonization of global health is such an important one, because in the world, our health is commodified. And until health is seen as a human right, as a public good, as an aspiration, and until we take on values of radical love, of care, until we recognize that women's bodies are complex and different, and when you give birth to a baby, you actually need a space of rest before you go back to being an agent of the system and working. Until we start looking deeper at how our bodies are made to function and how to allow our activity as human beings to complement our bodies and to, in relation to our environment, we're going to continuously be in trouble. And then the second point is, of course, the extractions, which really devastate our land and our earth, which lead us to a position where we have emergent viruses, where we have climate destruction. And this is another leg of the debate that we cannot escape from. And again, extraction is part of the commodification, And ultimately, we need to think of why schools of public health, why tropical medicine was formed. These fields were formed to keep the slaves healthy so that they can keep working the system, So we have a lot of complex history in the fields we are at. And so our imaginations need to be very active. We need to return to principles of care, of justice, of equity, of accountability, of radical love, and of real respecting the dignity and humanity of people. And that's where I'm talking about this radical power that sits inside of you. Where do you direct it? Do you direct it to building your individual career, which goes upwards? Or do you start being horizontal and you sacrifice your career, your publications, your whatever, towards a goal that leads to a different kind of world? And it's a very difficult choice to make, And that's why we need a collective conversation around it. Thank you.
I just wanted to basically echo again what everybody has been saying, how we need that collective conversation. How, when Shehnaz was saying, it's not like Gates Foundation is going to come and tell us, it's okay, take away our power, let's redistribute power. That is just not going to happen. So we have to decide. I think someone wrote on the comment box that instead of calling us the developing country or the third world country, should we be called the overexploited country? We who have been exploited for years, decades, centuries, we have to somehow be united. We have to have these conversations in our local forums. One of the, I think, comments, Olivia, that you were reading out of one of the questions, that where is all this wealth coming from? We should also probe into that, right? Where is Gates' wealth coming from? Where are other rich tycoons' wealth coming from? These are things that we are discussing in these forums. It is very difficult to have these conversations, oftentimes in our local communities, because again, going back to that theme, we haven't liberated ourselves. We haven't decolonized ourselves, where we, even now, a large chunk of the population think white is better. Where I know a collaborator in Bangladesh is more likely to actually work with a white colleague with a lot less experience than with me. Until we can change that, till we can really decolonize ourselves, liberate ourselves, be united, I don't think there is much more, further we can go. So, we have to be united, we have to have collective conversations, and we have to be ready to sacrifice for the next generation.
I think that's a really powerful thought. And just thinking about the context from people, I know you mentioned like the example of, having a collaborator like with maybe less experience, but is from a westernized nation or, is white, and people giving them more respect. For people in the global north, is giving up space something that people can do to act in solidarity?
Yes, absolutely. And I think Madhu has written about it often, right? Like in the global north, who are part of these conversations, white collaborators, white males need to lean out. There needs to be space created also. I think everybody has a role to play, and somehow we have to really figure out how everybody really plays their respective roles. And we have to have good systems of holding each other accountable. And that is what is lacking. It is not only accountability of the donors, also accountability of academic institutes in the global north, of the biggest public health schools of the global north. How are promotions determined? How are faculty positions determined? How is tenure determined? If it's only determined based on your authorship and papers and how many countries you worked in, that will that's a vicious cycle that will make everything worse. So institutions need to be held accountable. Institutions need to start having these conversations. There needs to be conversations about, if you were collaborating with a country in the global south, what did you leave behind in the country? Was the population, local community benefited from the work? And a lot of incentives should be based on benefits to the local community. And I think, when we are writing papers, because, that's the currency now of, journals, scientific journals was actually invented to communicate
not to be judged by how many papers you have published, right? This impact factor, paying for publication, is a completely new concept. But now that we are in this structure, I think it's really important, and maybe Abimbola wrote about it, I think in his foreign case also, that there should be these declarations at the end of the paper where, you know, you talk about what perspective you brought into the study. And I think there should be a more detailed look at conflict of interest. When we write about conflict of interest, we just assume it's about, oh, did you take money from any pharmaceutical company, etc. But conflict of interest is also when you are a global North collaborator, went to global South, and you did all of this to publish a paper to get a promotion. I think that is also conflict of interest. And somehow we have to, I think, put all of these into structure. I mean, it's easy for me to say all of these things. It's hard to implement, but these are the things we have to talk about. And it, you know, comes back to accountability of us all, you know, donors, collaborators in the global North, and us in the global South also.
Okay, I'll come in. I think, you know, this thing about leaning out, leaning down, leaning, you know, I think that conversation is really important, because it starts to then ask the question, how much power do I have? Where does my power sit? How do I enact my power? How do I use my power? For what purpose do I use my power? Where do I feel powerless? In what ways am I rendered invisible? And those questions around power, your personal power, that reflexivity is a journey that will help you to start being more conscious. So for us, I think we've called, you know, our African decolonial project a conscientization project. You know, and I think often there's this thing where, and South Africa is a perfect example, Nigeria, Bangladesh, India, a lot of the places that were colonized by the British, they were so clever that they built colonial replicas of the universities in Britain in South Africa. So we have Rhodes University, we have the University of the Witwatersrand, we have Afrikaans universities that reflect Dutch values. These are the universities that I have to enter into and learn. They adopt the same ideology and philosophy of Britain, not of the continent. And so we are colonial replicas, ultimately, you know. So even when I'm doing research in public health, I've got to figure out who am I needing to lean in, lean out, you know. I think we forget sometimes that privilege is, it's not a singular identity. We hold privilege, and we need to straddle these privilege in the spaces we occupy. And sometimes we may have even more privilege in the South than you would in the North. And it's not there's no single story around who's the one that needs to hand over. And sometimes I find it's a difficult conversation about how patriarchy plays out to other women or men, and how sometimes you would find, in order to be in a position of power, you need to adopt masculinity, and then you become a bully even, you know. So I see sometimes older women academics who bully women of color, who bully other women of color, you know. And part of it is to get to, because there's so few women of color that are vying for the same position, we end up in competition with each other, you know. So then you outsmarting each other rather than working as comrades in arms, working towards the same goal, towards, you know, it's supportive if both of us are progressing, or you know, celebrating each other's successes, you know. So to me, there's a beautiful book written by some South African academics, and some of them are psychologists, some of them are very different fields. And I'd encourage you to read this book. It's called Black Academic Voices, the South African Experience. And what they do in this book is they actually write about some of these critical moments of the racialized encounter in which Black academics who enter university spaces have to experience everyday experiences of racism. And when they're feeling like they don't belong, or they're feeling, the systemic oppression, they're sometimes called oversensitive or paranoid, or, you're racialized in different ways, and it reinforces your feeling of being excluded, So I think we've got to start, and that's, I think, part of the radical pragmatism, that it's not a technical thing in the mind, it's a very experienced thing. And then collectively, how do we resist? And people like Audre Lorde have told us that building, even thinkers like Pumla Kala, Sarah Ahmed, they've made us think about how do we come together to form feminist spaces, or spaces of thinking, of community of practice, where we can engage with each other, we can share our difficult experiences, so that we can disentangle from these racialized tropes, and that we can then interrogate how our power sits, where it sits, and how do we enact it in different spaces. And I think it is also, like you're doing now, you're engaging with people from the South, you're engaging with scholars, and I would argue that, pushing beyond people like me, who's an academic sitting in the university, you also need to maybe reach out to the NGOs, or reach out to women in communities, hear their voices, understanding that they may not be articulate in English, understanding that it may be harder to hear certain points, because we just want to be told the wisdom, just get the wisdom down and write it down, and we don't want to deal with we've got no time. But the work of decolonization is being slow, being thoughtful, and pushing beyond the big names, and not creating big names for these, but really to speak, finding the radical action and understanding what it means to mobilize, what it means to be othered on the ground, and bringing these voices into space, into these conferences to learn. And they'll have more answers than me, who sits in a sort of middle class, privileged home with a university education that's already partly, historically driven by learning westernized frameworks and reference points. I don't know that I'm the right person. I'm part of the conversation, but I'm not necessarily the one that can always know how to lean in, lean out, leaning to where, for what reason, how do we get to the social justice goal?
I just want to quickly, sorry. Yeah. No, I just want to quickly add to what Shehnaz said, and agree with every word she said. On the replica bit, I just want to bring our attention to the softer forms of, reproducing the knowledge, foreign knowledge. In the initial days and I'm again going back to the philanthropies, the Rockefellers and the all, which were developing chairs in India, the strategies those days were to place their consultants in India and train Indians abroad in their schools, so that we all learn Western medicine and the level and the quality of the procedures that are followed in those colleges. And we still till date take pride in being trained abroad and in those colleges and so on. So as students, we need to be more aware of, that this is part of a colonizing project, and we should be able to look at it more critically to see why this was put in place. This was put in place to ensure the quality that we provide as service providers. In terms of privilege, I want to add, talking about patriarchy and all. So as Shehnaz said, that we probably are, me, Shehnaz, and I'm sure Senjuti and Yap will reflect and resonate with those thoughts, that we always assume we're not the best people anyway, in terms of who are affected. We all come from probably, I'm assuming, similar class background and education backgrounds privileged to the caste. And we always assume that those who are at the community level do not have agency. We have to empower them. But the recent work with community health workers, and a lot again has been written about it, that these are not the women we need to empower. These are empowered women. They're well recognized in the communities. They have a lot of agency of their own. The community actually respects them. We as individuals, or researchers rather, or practitioners in global health, need to give them that space by leaning out and saying, okay, you come forward and put across your thought, which should directly feed into the policies, then us collecting information from you and then feeding into the policies, or advocating that your knowledge should be pushed into the agency. So we should be, if at all we feel there is a role for us, we should be that agent of kind of connecting those at the ground with the highest levels on. Another point that I want to bring into the discussion is that we haven't really touched upon is the role of the national governments, where all of the foreign actors coming, dismantling organization, if we take that word, that they purposely dismantled national institutions and national organizations, then it is also the responsibility of respective state governments to kind of take an assertive step to strengthen national institutions, to strengthen the quality of these institutions, to break those barriers of quality, which we assume, are more sophisticated abroad and not at home. And at the heart of all of this, nothing will work, I believe, till the time we don't ensure diversity, be it in national institutions, be it in policies at the national level, be it even at the grassroots among the community health workers. Diversity, even among the community health workers, will lead to better health outputs and health policies and so on. And we need to be very conscious as students, researchers, practitioners of global health to ensure that we have inclusive and diverse teams in which we're working. There is representation of everyone that we're talking about, or at least those who are affected. And though there is this recognition, we need to move beyond that tokenism of just tick boxing, that we have an LGBT, on our panel, we have a Black male, woman, or the person of the third gender on our panel or in our teams. We really have to be more cognizant of the fact on how to ensure diversity and inclusivity. And a lot of feminist work talks about and gives us the frameworks of intersectionality and all. There's a lot of work which we can refer to. It just involves a lot of deeper engagement and a heartfelt commitment for doing things truly. And believe me, this is all achievable. We have reached at that point of awareness. Now it's just about achieving these as the next generation, taking on the project of global health and decolonizing. Over.
I cannot agree more with what was just been said. And while I was listening to Sumegha and to the other panelists, I was asking myself, actually, who needs to be empowered? Is it us, actually? We always think about the community as if we are more knowledgeable. And we do think so because we are closer to the Western, because we have been educated and so on. I think we should rethink about how we need to be empowered so that we can definitely provide homegrown solution for our communities. And this goes back to where we started with the foreign gaze. Who is our target? Is our target our community, or our target the international or the global community? And I would say we need to build new communities where we will engage researchers, the community leaders, religious leaders, and all those people will have their own champions. Own champions mean also new criteria. We're talking about publication. Should we still need to target high impact journal versus journal where we say that they are more open to give back, to give the information to the communities? How do we do that? And it all goes back to accountability. Who are we accountable to? So eventually it's not a fight between Black and white. It's more a fight against privilege. Because when we think about decolonization, it's not only the West against the South, because in the global South, you also have people who are enjoying that colonization because of their position, because of their privilege. So I think we should have that in mind while we are building the strategy that professor from Ghana, I think, or Kenya, that it's definitely a revolution.
Okay, so unfortunately, we'll have to bring this panel to a close now to allow for a quick 15-minute lunch before we restart at 1. And Vivian, I just wanted to say that thank you to all the panelists for engaging so deeply and then thoughtfully with all of the questions. Quite frankly, it was an honor to share this space with you and hear from you. And yeah, so we'll have about 15 minutes. There was a number of great questions asked in the chat, and we'll be sure to download those and forward those on to all the attendees, and hopefully we can keep these conversations going.
Yeah, I think the conversation doesn't stop here, and it's certainly, we could have gone on this panel for hours, but because we have the panel on dismantling settler colonialism at 1 o'clock, we hope to see everyone back there to hear from our amazing speakers. And we're still trying to get in touch with Lee, so hopefully we'll be able to hear from her as well in terms of her keynote speech, but we'll keep everyone posted about that. And thank you so much again for joining us today. It was a true honor and privilege. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I'm sure we all just learned a lot.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Take care then. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye. And we also wanted to add that there is a reading list that has been sent out to everyone on the Eventbrite, and all of the articles and art and literature that's shared today will be included on that list, so you can continue to, critically engage with this in the future.
Bye.
Thank you.